The war is entering a dangerous new phase. More than 3 years after the war in Ukraine began, one thing has become increasingly clear. This is no longer just a regional conflict. It has evolved into a global strategic competition, one that influences military planning, economic policy, energy markets, and international diplomacy all at the same time. When the fighting first started, many analysts believed the conflict would be relatively short. Some predicted a rapid Russian victory. Others believed international sanctions would quickly force Moscow to change course. Neither prediction proved accurate. Instead, the war settled into something far more complicated, a prolonged confrontation where battlefield gains became measured in kilometers, economic pressure became a long-term strategy, and diplomacy struggled to keep pace with military developments. Today, the battlefield is only one part of the story. Every military operation is now followed by political reactions. Every new sanctions package triggers economic consequences. Every diplomatic summit raises new expectations, and every major announcement is analyzed not only for what it says, but for what it signals about the future. Perhaps the biggest change has been the growing distance between expectations and reality. Early in the conflict, public discussions often focused on decisive victories. Today, the conversation has shifted toward endurance. Which side can sustain its economy longer? Which alliance can maintain political unity? Which country can continue producing military equipment at the pace the conflict demands? These questions matter because modern wars are no longer decided solely by battlefield performance. Industrial capacity, international partnerships, financial resilience, technological innovation, public support, all have become essential parts of national power. This transformation has changed the way governments approach the conflict. Military operations are now designed not only to achieve tactical objectives, but also to influence negotiations, public opinion, and international perception. That brings us to one of the most important developments in recent months, the growing use of long-range drone attacks. These operations have captured headlines around the world. Images of explosions far from the front lines quickly spread across television networks and social media. To some observers, these attacks demonstrate growing military capability. Others argue their primary value is psychological rather than strategic. Whatever interpretation one accepts, they represent a new stage in the conflict. Because when military operations begin reaching areas that once appeared distant from the fighting, the political consequences become much larger. Questions that once seemed hypothetical suddenly become urgent. Could the conflict expand? Could additional countries become more directly involved? Or will both sides continue avoiding actions that might trigger a broader confrontation? No one can answer those questions with certainty, but understanding today's war requires looking beyond the headlines, because beneath every military operation lies a larger strategic calculation. And that calculation may determine not only how this conflict develops, but how future conflicts are managed around the world. Before we can understand those broader risks, we first need to examine why drone warfare has become one of the defining features of modern conflict. Why drone warfare is changing modern conflict. For most of military history, distance provided security. Cities located hundreds of kilometers from the battlefield often continued functioning almost normally. Factories remained open. Transportation continued. Daily life changed little. Modern technology has altered that reality. Long-range drones have introduced a new dimension to warfare. They are relatively inexpensive compared to advanced missiles. They can travel significant distances, and they can force governments to defend areas that were once considered relatively safe. This does not necessarily make them decisive weapons. Military analysts generally agree that drones alone rarely determine the outcome of major wars. Their importance often lies elsewhere. They increase uncertainty, require additional defensive resources, and influence public perception. When people witness explosions far from the traditional front line, the conflict suddenly feels much closer. Governments understand this psychological effect. Military planners understand it. Financial markets understand it as well. because modern conflicts are fought in multiple arenas simultaneously: on the battlefield, in cyberspace, across financial systems, within political institutions, and increasingly across the information environment. Every successful strike generates military questions, but it also creates political ones. How should governments respond? Will retaliation remain proportional, or could one incident gradually trigger broader escalation? These are difficult questions because every military response carries political consequences. Leaders must balance deterrence with restraint, strength with caution, resolve with diplomacy. This balancing act becomes even more complicated when multiple countries are involved: military assistance, intelligence sharing, economic sanctions, defense cooperation. Each element influences how governments interpret one another's intentions. That is why analysts often warn against focusing exclusively on individual attacks. The broader pattern matters far more. One isolated incident rarely changes history. A sustained cycle of escalation sometimes does. And this raises another important question. If long-range attacks continue increasing, where do governments draw the line? That question has become central to discussions in Moscow, Brussels, Washington, and many other capitals, because every government wants to avoid uncontrolled escalation, yet every government also wants to demonstrate determination. Finding that balance has become one of the defining strategic challenges of this conflict. Could the conflict spread beyond Ukraine? Whenever wars continue longer than expected, speculation inevitably grows. Will the fighting remain contained, or could neighboring countries become more directly involved? These questions have become increasingly common as the conflict enters another difficult phase. Officially, governments across Europe continue emphasizing that they do not seek direct war with Russia. NATO leaders have repeatedly stated that the alliance's objective is to support Ukraine while avoiding direct military confrontation with Moscow. Russian officials, meanwhile, have repeatedly criticized Western military assistance, arguing that it increases tensions and prolongs the conflict. These competing narratives illustrate one of the central challenges in international politics. Each side believes it is acting defensively. Each believes the other is increasing risks. This dynamic has been studied by political scientists for decades. It is often described as the security dilemma. When one government strengthens its security, its rival may interpret those actions as preparation for future aggression. It responds by expanding its own military capabilities. The first government then reacts again. Neither side necessarily intends to start a larger war, yet the overall level of tension continues rising. History offers many examples where misunderstandings prove just as dangerous as deliberate decisions. This is why communication between rival governments remains critically important. Military hotlines, diplomatic negotiations, international organizations all exist to reduce the possibility of accidental escalation. Even during periods of intense rivalry, dialogue often continues behind closed doors, because once communication disappears, the risk of miscalculation increases dramatically. That concern becomes especially important when nuclear-armed states are involved. Modern deterrence has prevented direct conflict between major nuclear powers for decades, but deterrence depends on predictable behavior, clear communication, and careful crisis management. If any of those elements weaken, strategic uncertainty grows. This does not mean a wider war is inevitable. Most experts continue to believe that governments have strong incentives to avoid direct confrontation. The economic, political, and humanitarian costs would be enormous for everyone involved. However, avoiding conflict requires continuous effort. Every military decision must be weighed against its diplomatic consequences. Every political statement must consider how it may be interpreted by rivals. In today's interconnected world, perception can influence events almost as much as reality itself. And as the conflict continues evolving, the next question becomes unavoidable. How does Russia interpret the actions of NATO and the West? Understanding that perspective, whether one agrees with it or not, is essential for understanding the strategic decisions that may come next. How Russia sees the West. To understand any conflict, it is never enough to study only one side. Every government acts according to its own understanding of history, security, and national interests. Whether outside observers agree with that perspective or not, it still shapes political decisions. And nowhere is that more evident than in the relationship between Russia and the West. For many Western governments, the years following the Cold War represented an opportunity to build a more stable and cooperative Europe. New alliances emerged, trade expanded, international institutions grew stronger. Many believed that military confrontation on the continent had become a thing of the past, but Moscow often viewed the same period differently. Russian officials have repeatedly argued that the post-Cold War security order failed to fully address Russia's concerns. From their perspective, the expansion of NATO eastward changed the military balance in Europe. Western governments reject the idea that NATO expansion was directed against Russia, emphasizing that sovereign nations have the right to choose their own alliances. These two interpretations continue to shape today's geopolitical debate. Neither side begins its analysis from the same historical starting point, and when countries interpret history differently, they often reach very different conclusions about the present. This difference in perception has become one of the defining characteristics of the current crisis. Military exercises that one side describes as defensive may be viewed by the other as preparation for future confrontation. New missile systems intended as deterrence may be interpreted elsewhere as offensive capabilities. Even political speeches can carry strategic significance. Every announcement is carefully examined, every military deployment is monitored, every diplomatic statement is analyzed for hidden signals. Because in modern geopolitics, perception often influences reality. This helps explain why trust has become increasingly difficult to rebuild. Years of sanctions, diplomatic expulsions, cybersecurity disputes, and military competition have steadily reduced communication between both sides. The fewer opportunities leaders have to speak directly, the greater the risk that assumptions replace facts. History demonstrates why this matters. During the Cold War, despite profound ideological rivalry, both Washington and Moscow maintained direct communication channels, arms control agreements, emergency hotlines, regular diplomatic meetings. These mechanisms did not eliminate competition, but they reduced the risk of accidental escalation. Many security experts argue that maintaining dialogue between rivals is not a sign of weakness. It is a practical necessity. When communication disappears, misunderstandings become more likely. And misunderstandings between major military powers can have consequences far beyond the immediate crisis. Another important aspect is domestic politics. Governments do not make foreign policy decisions in isolation. Leaders must also consider public opinion, economic conditions, political opposition, and national expectations. These internal pressures influence how governments respond during international crises. In Russia, officials frequently emphasize national sovereignty, strategic independence, and resistance to external pressure. In many Western countries, leaders focus on international law, collective security, and support for allies. These competing narratives shape public understanding on both sides. As a result, compromise becomes politically more difficult. Even when diplomacy may offer practical solutions, economic factors also play an increasingly important role. Sanctions have affected trade, energy markets have adapted, supply chains have changed, countries have searched for new commercial partners. Some analysts argue that economic competition has become almost as important as military competition. Others believe economic interdependence can eventually encourage renewed diplomatic engagement. The outcome remains uncertain. Technology has added another layer of complexity: cybersecurity, artificial intelligence, satellite intelligence, electronic warfare, long-range precision systems. These capabilities allow governments to compete without direct conventional confrontation. Modern conflicts therefore extend far beyond traditional battlefields. Information itself has become part of strategic competition. Public messaging, media coverage, official statements, online campaigns, all influence how international events are understood around the world. This information environment creates new challenges for governments. Responding too aggressively may increase tensions. Responding too cautiously may appear as weakness. Finding the right balance requires careful political judgment. Perhaps that is why today's confrontation differs from many previous conflicts. Military power remains essential, but influence now depends just as much on diplomacy, economic resilience, technological innovation, and international credibility. No single element alone determines success. Every decision produces consequences across multiple domains simultaneously. This complexity makes predicting future developments extremely difficult. Some experts believe prolonged competition will continue for years. Others hope diplomatic negotiations may gradually reduce tensions. Neither outcome is guaranteed. What is certain is that decisions made today will influence European security for decades, and as both sides continue strengthening their military capabilities, one question becomes impossible to ignore. How can deterrence prevent war without creating the very escalation it is meant to avoid? That question leads directly into the final chapters of this documentary, where we'll explore the future of NATO, the role of diplomacy, and whether a new European security framework is still possible.